Warning. The following video is meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken otherwise. Apex Crime Lords does not condone, encourage, or glorify the actions of the individuals covered in this program. Viewer discretion is advised. Paul Castellano, a name that once struck fear into the heart of New York City. As the head of the notorious Gambino crime family, Castellano was one of the most powerful and influential mafia bosses of his time. But his reign was as controversial as it was ruthless, marked by a brutal power struggle that would ultimately lead to his downfall. In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into the life and times of Paul Castellano, the so-called boss of bosses. From his early days as a butcher's son to his rise through the ranks of the Gambino family, we'll explore the key events and personality traits that shaped his leadership. We'll also examine the controversies and conflicts that plagued his tenure, including his tense relationship with the infamous John Gotti. But beyond the sensational headlines and Hollywood depictions, we'll try to understand the man behind the myth. What drove Castellano to pursue a life of crime? How did he navigate the treacherous waters of the New York underworld? And what ultimately led to his shocking demise in one of the most notorious mob hits of all time? So buckle up and get ready for a journey into the heart of American organized crime. This is the story of Paul Castellano, the rise and fall of the Gambino crime family's boss of bosses. Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915, in Brooklyn, New York. The son of a Sicilian-born butcher, Castellano grew up in a tight-knit Italian-American community where loyalty to family and tradition were paramount. From a young age, Castellano was exposed to the world of organized crime. His uncle, Giuseppe Castellano, was a high-ranking member of the Mangiano crime family, which would later become the Gambino family under the leadership of Carlo Gambino. As a teenager, Castellano began running errands and doing odd jobs for his uncle and other mobsters, slowly gaining their trust and respect. In 1934, at the age of 19, Castellano was arrested for the first time for grand larceny auto. It was a minor offense, but it marked the beginning of a long and turbulent criminal career. Over the next few decades, Castellano would be arrested multiple times for crimes ranging from assault to conspiracy, though he managed to avoid any significant jail time. Despite his brushes with the law, Castellano was a rising star in the Mangiano Gambino family. He was known for his business acumen and his ability to generate profits through a variety of legal and illegal enterprises. In the 1940s and 50s, he established himself as a key player in the New York meat industry, using his connections to secure lucrative government contracts and union deals. Castellano's rise through the ranks of the Gambino family was aided by his close relationship with Carlo Gambino, who became the family's boss in 1957. Gambino recognized Castellano's intelligence and loyalty, and rewarded him with increasing responsibility and power within the organization. By the 1960s, Castellano was one of Gambino's most trusted lieutenants, overseeing a vast criminal empire that included illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and extortion. But Castellano was more than just a skilled criminal operator. He was also a devoted family man, married to his wife Nina for over 30 years and the father of 3 sons. He was known for his love of fine dining, expensive suits, and luxury cars, and he had cultivated an image as a sophisticated businessman and a pillar of the community. However, beneath the veneer of respectability, Castellano was a ruthless and calculating mobster who would stop at nothing to protect his power and profits. As he rose higher in the Gambino hierarchy, he would face numerous challenges and enemies, both from within the family and from rival factions in the New York underworld. His ability to navigate these treacherous waters would define his legacy as one of the most formidable and feared mafia bosses of his generation. Paul Castellano's rise to the top of the Gambino crime family was a gradual but a steady one, marked by his unwavering loyalty to Carlo Gambino and his shrewd business sense. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, as Gambino's health declined, Castellano took on more and more responsibility for running the family's day-to-day operations. One of Castellano's key strengths was his ability to adapt to changing times and find new ways to generate profits for the family. He was one of the first mobsters to recognize the potential of the construction industry as a source of illicit income, using his influence to secure lucrative contracts and to control labor unions. He also expanded the family's interest in the garbage hauling industry, a notoriously corrupt and mob-controlled business. But Castellano wasn't just a savvy businessman. He was also a ruthless enforcer when necessary. In 1975, he allegedly ordered the murder of his own cousin, Thomas Gambino, in a dispute over the family's garment industry rackets. The hit was a shocking display of Castellano's willingness to use violence to protect his interests, even against his own blood. Despite this, Castellano managed to maintain a relatively low profile compared to some of his more flashy contemporaries. He preferred to operate behind the scenes, using his political connection and business acumen to quietly build his power and wealth. By the time Carlo Gambino died in 1976, Castellano was well positioned to take over as the new boss of the Gambino family. However, Castellano's succession was not without controversy. Many in the family believed that Agnello Della Croce, a respected and long-serving underboss, should have taken over instead. Della Croce had the support of many of the family's younger, more aggressive members, including a rising star named John Gotti. Castellano was aware of the potential threats to his power and moved quickly to consolidate his position. He named Della Croce as his underboss, but made it clear that he was the ultimate authority in the family. He also sought to diversify the Gambino's interest beyond traditional rackets like gambling and loan sharking, investing in legitimate business and real estate. Under Castellano's leadership, the Gambino family continued to be one of the most powerful and profitable criminal organizations in America, but his tenure would also be marked by growing internal tensions and external threats, as law enforcement agencies and rival families sought to undermine his power. One of the biggest challenges to Castellano's authority came from within his own family, in the form of John Gotti and his crew. Gotti, a charismatic and ambitious capo, scoffed at Castellano's leadership style, seeing him as a disconnected and overly cautious boss. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the stage was set for a power struggle that would rock the Gambino family to its core. As the 1980s began, Paul Castellano was at the height of his power as the boss of the Gambino crime family. But despite his firm grip on the organization, he faced a growing array of challenges and threats that would test his leadership like never before. One of the biggest problems was the increasing heat from law enforcement. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office had made the Gambino family a top priority, and they were using new tools like wiretaps and surveillance to build cases against Castellano and his associates. In 1983, Castellano was indicted on federal racketeering charges, though he managed to avoid conviction through a combination of legal maneuvering and jury tampering. But the legal troubles were only part of Castellano's worries. He was also facing growing threat from within his own ranks, in the form of John Gotti and his crew. Gotti had long been a thorn in Castellano's side, a brash and ambitious capo who wasn't afraid to challenge the boss's authority. In 1980, Gotti had been involved in the unsanctioned murder of a Gambino associate, which had brought unwanted attention to the family. Castellano had been furious, but he had ultimately let Gotti off with a warning. As the years went on, however, the tension between Castellano and Gotti only grew. Gotti and his crew were making huge profits in the heroin trade, a business that Castellano had strictly forbidden. Castellano saw the drug trade as too risky and too likely to attract the attention of law enforcement, but Gotti and his men were willing to take the risk for huge potential profits. Castellano tried to rein in Gotti and his crew, but his efforts only seemed to make matters worse. Gotti and his supporters saw Castellano as weak and out of touch, a boss who was more interested in his own wealth and comfort than in the good of the family. They began to openly defy Castellano's orders and talk of replacing him as boss. For his part, Castellano was growing increasingly paranoid and isolated. He rarely left his lavish mansion on Staten Island, and he communicated with his underlings mainly through intermediaries. He was also facing personal problems, including the deterioration of his marriage and the strain of supporting his mistress and their children. Despite all of these difficulties, Castellano managed to hold on to the power for several more years. He used his political connections and his vast wealth to keep potential rivals at bay, and he continued to expand the Gambino's interest in industries like construction and waste management. But by 1985, the situation had become unmanageable. Gotti and his faction were growing more and more brazen in their defiance of Castellano, and there were rumors of an impending coup. Castellano, who was desperate to shore up his support, called a meeting of the family's top leaders at the Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. It was a fateful decision. On December 16, 1985, as Castellano arrived at the restaurant, he was ambushed by a team of gunmen led by Gotti himself. Castellano and his bodyguard were met with a hail of bullets, their blood staining the sidewalk outside the famous steakhouse. The hit on Castellano was a shocking and audacious move, even by the standards of the New York Mafia. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the Commission, the governing body of the American mob, and it plunged the Gambino family into a period of chaos and uncertainty. The assassination of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse on that fateful December evening in 1985 sent shockwaves through the New York underworld. It was a brazen power play by John Gotti, a capo who had long suffered under Castellano's leadership and who saw an opportunity to seize control of the Gambino family for himself. In the immediate aftermath of the hit, Gotti moved quickly to consolidate his power. He called a meeting of the family's top leaders and announced that he was taking over as the new boss. He also named his longtime ally, Sammy the Bull Gravano, as his underboss, cementing his control over the organization. At first, it seemed like Gotti's gamble had paid off. The Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, was initially skeptical of Gotti's power grab, but they ultimately accepted him as the new head of the Gambino family. For his part, Gotti reveled in his new status, cultivating a flamboyant public image as the Dapper Don, and brazenly defying law enforcement efforts to bring him down. But Gotti's reign would prove to be short-lived. His high-profile antics and his reckless approach to the business of organized crime soon attracted the attention of federal authorities, who made him a top priority. In 1990, Gotti was arrested on racketeering and murder charges, and he was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The fall of Gotti was a turning point for the Gambino family and for the American Mafia. It demonstrated the increasing effectiveness of law enforcement efforts to combat organized crime, and it showed that even the most powerful and feared mob bosses were not invincible. In the years that followed, the Gambino family would never regain the power and influence it once had under Castellano and Gotti. Subsequent leaders like Gotti's son, John Jr. Gotti, would try to steer the family in new directions, but they were ultimately unsuccessful in reviving its fortunes. As for Castellano himself, his legacy remains a complicated and controversial one. On one hand, he was a ruthless and calculating mob boss who was not afraid to use violence and intimidation to protect his interests. He was also deeply involved in a wide range of illegal activities, from labor racketeering to extortion and murder. But Castellano was also a complex and multifaceted figure, a man who valued family and loyalty above all else, and who saw himself as a businessman and a community leader as much as a criminal. He was a product of his time and place, a figure who rose to power in a world where the lines between legitimate business and organized crime were often blurred. In the end, Castellano's story is a cautionary tale about the perils of power and the ultimate price of a life lived in the shadows. It's a reminder that even the most seemingly invincible figures can fall, and that the world of organized crime is ultimately a brutal and unforgiving one. The story of Paul Castellano is a fascinating and complex one, a tale of power, ambition, and ultimately a tragic downfall. As the head of the Gambino crime family, Castellano was one of the most powerful and influential mafia bosses of his generation, a man who controlled a vast empire that stretched from New York to Florida to Las Vegas. But Castellano's reign was also marked by controversy and conflict, by internal power struggles and external threats from law enforcement and rival families. His attempt to balance the demands of tradition and loyalty with the need to adapt to changing times and new opportunities ultimately proved to be his undoing, as he faced challenges from within his own ranks and from the larger forces of history. In the end, Castellano's life is a reminder of a true cost of a life lived in the world of organized crime. Despite his wealth and power, he was ultimately a victim of the very system he helped to create and sustain, a man who lived and died by the code of the streets. But Castellano's legacy is also a complex and multifaceted one. He was a man who valued family and community, and who saw himself as a businessman and leader as much as a criminal. He was a product of his time and place. As we reflect on the life and times of Paul Castellano, it's important to remember that his story is not just a tale of individual ambition and ego, but also a broader commentary on the nature of power, and the corrosive influence of organized crime on American society. It's a reminder that the true cost of the mob's influence is measured not just in dollars and cents, but in lives lost and communities destroyed. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of Paul Castellano is a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the ultimate futility of life lived in the shadows of the underworld. It's a story that continues to resonate today as we grapple with the ongoing challenges of crime, corruption, and the abuse of power in all forms. Thank you for joining us on this deeper dive into the life and times of Paul Castellano, the Gambino crime family's boss of bosses. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking, and we encourage you to continue exploring the complex and often troubling history of organized crime in America. As always, we welcome your feedback and engagement. If you have any thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please leave them in the comments below. If you found this video valuable, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and keep questioning the world around you. The truth, after all, is rarely as simple as it seems, especially in the shadowy realm of the American underworld. Until next time, stay safe and stay dangerous.